You've spent multiple decades studying
Yes.
the right wing in America, so you're a good
Multiple
person to
decades.
talk to about this. And thankfully, you're still sane. And specifically, Reagan in your most recent book, talk about how Reagan specifically targeted people with authoritarian tendencies and how we can see a lot of those shades, or I guess the manifestations or the multiplications in what we saw in the Capitol insurrection now 6 months ago.
Yes, if I said to you that the Reagan presidential campaign in 1980 targeted people with authoritarian tendencies, you might accuse me of, slandering Ronald Reagan. But in this particular case, I literally have a historical document in which they pretty much say, let's target people with authoritarian tendencies, right? So the document in question, actually, which I read about in Advertising Age magazine, in an article about his pollster, Richard Worthlin, in an article about how he strategized for the Reagan campaign and won Advertising Age's Ad Man of the Year, which is kind of goofy and interesting in itself. One of the things that one of this guy Worthlin's aides told the reporter was that Reagan supporters, quote, obtain high scores on authoritarianism and a low score on egalitarianism. And then they also discover basically that European ethnic groups living in large cities followed the same pattern, and hence they were a prime target of conversion. So, and this is a quote, that Reagan launched his campaign with quite highly visible visits to such neighborhoods. So literally they're like, let's find people who, are Democrats, right? Then Democrats then, and that we can turn into Republicans. And the way we're going to find them is to find these pockets where people are most likely to be authoritarians. And these were places like South Boston, where there had been this terrible controversy over busing, where people basically fought the police to keep their kids from going to school with Black people, or Cicero, Illinois, which is a formerly all-white suburb of Chicago, where Martin Luther King was warned by the county sheriff that if he held a housing march there, he'd be committing a suicidal act. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which was the most segregated city in America, which was kind of undergoing a very big reckoning when it came to police violence against African Americans. And this is literally, where Ronald Reagan, we know that Ronald Reagan opened his general election campaign, right, in the summer of 1980 in Neshoba County, which is another great, example of a place where you'd find a lot of authoritarians, because, of course, this was where Goodman, Cheney, and Schweiner were lynched in 1964 for registering African Americans to vote. But this was actually the opening of his primary campaign. And so that's what they did. And I found something else that was very interesting in this article, and it shows basically in the most elegant way I've ever been able to come up with, because this is not really a complicated concept, but I've never really found a really elegant way to kind of a hammer to really kind of get this across to people. The devolution of the Republican Party from Reagan to Trump. So yeah, it's bad enough that a political party is saying, let's find thugs, so we can, basically turn them into Republicans so we can win a presidential election. That's really nasty in itself. But one of the aide who basically explained this to the reporter said, well, Ronald Reagan said he didn't want to do this anymore, so we stopped, going to these places. And I don't really know what he was talking about, because they, never, their appeal to authoritarians never really ebbed. But what's fascinating about that is, this expression of shame, right? This very admission that what they were doing was something that they kind of shouldn't have been doing. And I think that the difference between the Ronald Reagan generation that was kind of prospecting for authoritarians, and by that you can include the, George H.W. Bush generation, the George W. Bush generation, the Mitt Romney generation, basically all Reagan Republicans up to Donald Trump, was Donald Trump kind of rips off the mask and says, well, we're going to do this without shame. This is the guy who walks into his, debut as a presidential campaign and says, Mexico is sending their rapists, and the Middle East too, right? So what we have is kind of this subtle, double-faced appeal to authoritarians that can kind of hide what it does and look respectable, to this outright naked appeal to authoritarians. And here we are. And kind of the thesis I pursue after making that point in this little article of mine is, well, if you build your political power on a naked appeal to authoritarians, of course things are going to get out of hand. And I tell a little bit about that history as I see it.
But part of, the misunderstanding about that is, and so well said by you, is a seemingly deliberate sanitizing and misunderstanding of that history, right?
Yeah,
where
we
it's
get into the media piece, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, it's not just the media. I really do think that there are a lot of Democrats from that era, of the Reagan era, who kind of want to believe something different about that era of conservative dominance, or at least have like some sort of shell-shocked PTSD, colloquially. Yeah. I was not alive during the Reagan era, and what's been told to me is just, oh, he appealed to working class whites, right, of Italian descent, of Irish
optimism
descent. Right. And so, I mean, that's just so counterfactual. And so I'm assuming that's a lot of what you write about in your book and what you talk about a little bit or significantly, but not as in depth as in your book, I presume, in this piece in New York Magazine. I mean, if you could just touch upon that chasm in understanding.
Sure. Chris Matthews, formerly of MSNBC, wrote a whole book about what a wonderful, warm, rich relationship these two sons of Irish immigrants, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, had for each other, because they had, scotch after work and, were civil and could pursue negotiations. And of course, the reason Ronald Reagan pursued negotiations with Tip O'Neill was because Democrats had lots of power, right? He did it because he had to. So the answer to that story is, well, if you want, to have a more civil politics where Republicans have to respect us, the answer is beat Republicans, right? It's not be nice to Republicans, right? So this whole idea is, this sentimental fantasy. And, there's a big, because we are a country that's, has lots of structural nastiness built into it, I think a lot of all kinds of elites, whether they're media elites or political elites, kind of see this part of their job ideologically as kind of tamping down the reality, right, of just how ugly, violent, hateful a lot of our fellow Americans are, right? And, it's important to be kind of unflinching and understanding the country that we are citizens of.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.